Good afternoon, my friends. Welcome to our New Testament challenge. Today I'll be sharing some thoughts and reflections from the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 16. It has been a fast and furious ride through Mark these last 2 weeks and a few days, and it's interesting. So let's dive right in. So the beginning of chapter 16 is Mark's version of the of Easter sunrise. Now, what is interesting is that each of the four Gospels has a slightly different version of what happened that morning. It's not saying that one is right and the other's wrong, but again, they looked at different things, and what's interesting is trying to read what Mark says without also pushing in what we know from the others. So look at what makes Mark unique. I think that'll be helpful in our study. So when the Sabbath was over, so early Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. So what that says is that Joseph of Arimathea, who had gotten the body of Christ, had not had time, being as it was late in the day on Friday, had not had time to properly anoint the body for burial. And so they were going to do that. He just wrapped him up, put him in the tomb, and closed it. So the ladies were taking the spices, and they were going to do what was necessary. And so very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had just risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone?" You know, they hadn't thought that far, and they were like, "Okay, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get into that?" And when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered it, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. That's kind of funny. They're always alarmed, always scared, and I guess I would be too, if I was not used to seeing angels, and all of a sudden, boom, there was an angel. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." It's interesting. He kind of says, now listen, Jesus told you several times that he was going to die, and he was going to raise again, and then he would meet them in Galilee several times. And he says, all right, we want you to go tell them. You are going to be the first evangelist, really. You'd be the first ones to tell the good news. Go tell his disciples, and this is interesting, and Peter. So at that point, Peter, whether through self-declaration or through the stories that went out, was not known as one of the disciples because he had disowned and denied knowing Christ those 3 times. So that's interesting, but the angel still wanted Peter to know what was going on. And there you will see him, just as he said. So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So even though they were told, they didn't tell anybody, which is interesting. Although I think they did eventually tell someone. But I think I like this because this is oftentimes the other, have them going and saying, "I've seen the Lord," and they were amazed and stuff. I think this is probably a little more real. That they still just were blown away by what they had heard. And this, again, proclaims the radical nature of the death and resurrection of the Messiah. And we have, over 2,000 years, we're used to the story. It has become a part of who we are. But to know and experience that the very first time, you can just imagine the terror and the amazement that these ladies felt. Now, at this point in time, the Gospel of Mark has what they call a shorter ending. It ends right there. but then there are, at the end of verse 8, and then from verse 9 all the way through verse 20, there is an additional ending that we have historically used. And now, as we are finding old fragments of Mark, some have this additional ending, some do not. Some of the old ones do not, and that they end there. And so that's kind of interesting. They said, that, okay, the shorter ending, actually, after they left and they were afraid, it says, all that they had commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So they do eventually go and tell the disciples and to tell Peter. Now, the longer ending, again, so some other things, and some people say yes, it happened. Others, not so much, but it's here, and so I think we take it seriously. The longer ending shows Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons, and she went out and told those who were with them while they were mourning and weeping, but they didn't believe her. Okay, that sounds familiar to the ending of Matthew, where Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. Then, in verse 12, he appears to 2 disciples. Again, it sounds familiar to the road to Emmaus. Another gospel talks about that and spends more time talking about Jesus, talking to the 2 disciples. But finally, he comes back and he meets the 11, and he kind of chastises them for their lack of faith and stubbornness. And then he says, I want you to go into the world proclaiming the good news. And the one who believes will be believed and baptized will be saved, but the one who does not will be condemned. And these signs will accompany you. And he said there will be casting out of demons, they'll be speaking of tongues. This next verse is very key. They will pick up snakes in their hands, and if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. The worshiping with snakes. You've heard of that, and we've seen stories about that, and this is where that comes from. This is where, for some believers, this is kind of almost a proof of faith, that they truly believe in God. I know a friend of mine has taught sociology and did some studies of some of the snake handling churches up in the mountains of North Georgia. So it's still there somewhere, but this is where they get that you are able to pick up snakes in your hands and drink poison and not be harmed. And so after that, he had spoken to him. He was taken up into heaven and sat down on the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere. So we think about, okay, this is the end of the story. Well, it's really the beginning of the church. This is the end of the story of Jesus. And so next chapter is the chapter of the church, and we will find out more about that as we go through the rest of the New Testament. Hopefully this has been helpful, my friends. Take care, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow.